Today, I'm being joined by Dr. Ann Burgess herself as India grapples with the rise in crime against women. I'm going to welcome Dr. Ann C. Walbert Burgess, an American researcher, renowned psychologist and profiler of serial killers, with us on NewsX. Ma'am, thank you so much, firstly, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you, Dr. Ann, please tell our audience here in India how exactly you got started with working with trauma and rape victims.
My work in this area actually started with a project that my partner and I started at Boston City Hospital, seeing anyone coming in with a complaint of rape. So it was really over a one-year period that we saw 146 people between the ages of 3 and 73 that had a complaint of rape.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, when I was reading about your work, ma'am, I also saw that what made your study stand apart from the rest was the fact that you were able to somehow quantify the trauma of rape victims, even though it is, of course, every case we believe today is different, every experience, every emotion felt has to be different, but you were able to somewhere quantify it. What system of quantification and categorization, ma'am, did you develop?
Yes, at the time that we did the study, that is what started my work in this area of understanding the implications of rape to women. It was a problem in our country, of course. Not that it has become any easier, but at least we started to understand what happened to someone that was raped. But from that study, the more important part was what was causing it. So our study on rapists, men who primarily went out to rape women, became very important. And that's what really drew me to the FBI study on profiling.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, of course, I would want you to explain to our Indian audience, ma'am, a little bit more about how you got involved with the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI.
Oh, they had a mandate at that particular time. This was in the early 1970s. They had a mandate because of the women's movement was putting a lot of pressure on Congress to do something about the problem of rape. And so the head of the FBI was a new person, a William Webster. He was brand new, young, very bright, very forward thinking. And so he said, we must train our special agents because they had no specialized unit for this. And so I was called down to lecture to them on the problem of rape and what we were finding in our study. And that was giving the special agents information about the victim, because they had not any kind of information about that. And that's really how I was invited down, and it was decided to expand into studying offenders, criminals. And that's where it was a criminal personality profile project that I started with Bob Ressler and John Douglas at the FBI Academy.
Okay, Dr. Burgess, what exactly then were your learnings about the psychosis then of sexual predators, their psychology?
Well, we learned a number of things about sexual predators, but most of all, we learned that there is no one single pattern. There are several patterns. And that's what became important, of how to identify the type of offender. That would then direct the agent to look for a more of a wider scope, if you will, of offenders. And we essentially had identified about 4 major types. And also eliminated the myth, the bias, if you will, that rape was a sexual crime.
Okay.
It was much more a crime of dominance, power. Of course, it happened within a sexual context, but the psychological motives were much more related to being in control, being powerful, and selecting someone that they could dominate.
And ma'am, at the same time, Dr. Burgess, what exactly have we learned about people then who become rapists and murderers?
Well, we've learned several things. Most importantly, we have learned that it is in their head. It is what we call a fantasy that gets developed, and that becomes what they project onto the victim. So it's in their thinking. You have to understand their thinking patterns, and we are now in another phase of our subject looking at the kinds of things that are posted on social media to see if we can identify early someone that is going to be a predator. That's,
Excellent. Yes.
however, there are four different types. I was going to say there are two that really fall into the power area, and then two that fall into the aggression, where it's either anger rape or it's sadistic rape. And both of those two, of course, can have a lethal outcome.
Okay, very interesting, Dr. Burgess, because you're talking about what the FBI is currently also focusing on, that they've started also looking at social media, which is, of course, what is rapidly being used out there in today's world. But I also want to understand from you, ma'am, in a lot of cases, Dr. Burgess, it was seen in the past as well that most people who were convicted as serial murderers or serial rapists, they were pronounced sane at the time of their convictions. So there was no sort of insanity around them. And of course, those terms are very, very technical as far as the medical profession is concerned. But I just want to understand from you, are there psychological circumstances or certain psychological issues or neurological issues that were also found maybe as a pattern amongst the people that you've studied?
I'm not sure it's neurological issues, but it certainly is psychological and emotional issues. What became important working with the special agents is the behavioral aspect. They could identify behaviors rather than psychology. That fell more into a different group of psychologists. But the agents were very behaviorally oriented. So we tried to identify those behaviors that would alert someone to a particular type of rapist or murderer.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, quite interestingly, ma'am, I'm going to come a bit to why we're essentially having this conversation with you today. In America, of course, has a head start because your studies started in the 1970s and 80s. So it's been many, many decades of studying criminal behavior, of studying the psychology of criminals, of serial killers, of rapists and murderers. And of course, you have decades worth of information. But if, ma'am, today in India, we were to duplicate or to conduct our own study of convicted rapists and murderers, how would you then recommend that we go about it? Because as you've mentioned, the FBI is already looking at certain aspects of how the world is today. For example, tracking social media to understand what really, or to identify people who may have tendencies that are antisocial in nature. How would you recommend we go about it, ma'am?
Well, what I'd recommend is first you have to get approval that it is a problem. I think you have done that certainly with not only this case, but I have been reading about on your news networks about it has been a problem for some time. So that they are, as I understand it, looking at safety measures. Those are fine, certainly to put in transportation kinds of things or surveillance or whatever. But the real project is to study the motives and to find out why this is happening. And it looks like men believe they can get away with this.
Okay.
I looked at your statistics and they're really terrible as far as statistics for women. So something has to be, it has to be seen as unacceptable. It has to be seen as something that law enforcement can get into right away. And it's a cultural kind of a issue, it looks like, from just my viewing some of your news outlet stories.
Dr. Burgess, at the same time, what sort of knowledge can then be exchanged with perhaps an expert committee from India so that we can also train our law enforcement agencies and counselors?
Oh, yes, I think you need to, law enforcement must, not only law enforcement, but all those in the criminal justice system need you have to get at the bias, what we call the bias that they have, that it's man's prerogative or whatever it is. The whole domestic violence issue looks like it's an issue, certainly in this particular case that you're calling about, that there was domestic violence as well as prior events, which I would have suggested were there if you had not come up with a suspect.
Okay, Dr. Ann Burgess, I know I have a limited time with you, ma'am, but I have two more questions before I let you go. I want to firstly understand from you, through the course of your study, you've also shed some light on what is it that women can do to protect themselves. If you can share the same with our audience in India, please.
Well, women can do several things to protect themselves. First of all, to have, well, I would say that certainly to have travel in pairs, I think that's important, although that doesn't necessarily protect the person. I remember one offender that said to me, the woman can do all that she wants to do, but if I really want to do this, I will do it. So that was just an American talking. He was a serial rapist. But I think that you have to look at the vulnerability of women, that they have extra protection. I mean, that means locks on doors, it means better surveillance, it means a more responsive. I think the key thing is a responsive law enforcement. It doesn't look like they are being very responsive looking at your statistics. They almost look like they're being overwhelmed with cases coming in. So therefore, how many women are available to help work with law enforcement? Do you have what we call rape crisis centers in which that they can mobilize and provide some kind of aftermath situations? Those are all questions that you'd have to see if you could put together for a program so that women would feel safe. I think right now that the protests are very important. They must get the attention of the higher ups, if you will, in your government to see they've got to do something. And it's got to be more than just saying that they're going to put some extra lighting or some extra moving people safely from, say, one hospital to another. When you have a workplace crime, that's very hard because people need to feel safe when they're in the workplace.
Yes.
So I think that puts the pressure also on the workplace, which we have had to do all these things in America so that workplace feels safer. And hospitals are places where people can, what we call, act out aggressively for some reason that it can happen, that we need to watch that very carefully. Workplace safety.
Absolutely. Dr. Burgess, before we let you go, ma'am, one last question. What would be your then most important recommendation to law enforcement agencies?
Law enforcement needs the education about the dynamics, what we call the dynamics of rape, of what goes on, how the victim is determined. Most victims we have found have been under surveillance by the offender, that person has watched or knew the routine of that person, so that it isn't what we would necessarily call a stranger, and maybe a stranger to the victim, but it's not a stranger from the offender standpoint. So I think that it's very important that law enforcement have the education about the various aspects of rape. And that's where the FBI here in America had to start. They got lecturers in to talk about the dynamics of rape, not necessarily from the victim standpoint, but certainly from the offender standpoint.
Dr. Ann Burgess, thank you so much, ma'am.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.